addictive. So if you know, fun, familiar things like Zeppelin being transformed into loops, layers, bits and pieces, of course you have to think about everything from the digital resolution of the file, the way it's been imported. All of those things go into your selection and the way that you configure the visual and now audio and so on. Now, if we want to do the same thing with video, there's plenty of people doing the same thing with that. But the whole notion is that it's about play and irreverence for the forms that people normally have like kind of remembered of something. So the remix and graphic design seem to be very much interrelated. One of the other things I wanted to show really quick was a clip from a film that does a similar kind of thing, and it's called Copyright Criminals. The basic idea here is that we're seeing kind of an entire generation of people growing up this way, and I wanted to kind of use this trailer as a way of kind of reinforcing that, but you'll see the other artists who do the same thing. And again, I want to make sure to tie this into graphic design and interface, so bear with me as we go. Here we go.
So someone recorded this sound. So does that mean that only if I go?
If you sample one note of a sound recording, it's copyright infringement.
It's actually taking sounds and meshing them together and putting them all in time to come up with something totally different.
By ignoring the rules, they came up with a whole new way of thinking about music.
Always buying records, searching. That bass line.
We grabbed conga sounds, trumpet sounds, violin sounds, drum beat sounds, and remanipulated and created our own music.
Basically, when I'm sampling, I have all these artists. They're in my band. You can't just have a record that's made up of everybody else's records and then not pay them for it. You pay for a guitar, you pay for a piano, you pay for anything else that you make a song with.
At the end of the day, the court said, not only is this copyright infringement, but we see criminal prosecution in line for this one.
Some of those first sampling cases, De La Soul, Biz Markie, P.E., and others, it wasn't that they were trying to be thieves or trying not to get caught. It was just like we kind of didn't know. Sampling was a very intricate thing for us. It was creating a collage.
We kind of looked at music as a assemblage of sounds, and we felt that you couldn't copyright a sound.
Well, welcome to the Terror Dome!
So many groups unsample my stuff. They say I'm the world's #1 sampler drummer, so hey, I haven't got a penny for it yet, though, but I'm Clyde Stubblefield, the original funky drummer.
His name never appears on any of those compositional credits. He doesn't get royalties. He got paid for the time in the studio.
My music is my life. Baby.
Look, nobody took hip-hop seriously until it started making a lot of money.
And naturally, the lawyers moved in.
If you can't tell, the
People were getting sued for music they were making.
Yeah, I got sued for sampling all that stuff.
I've sued and I've been sued. That's the nature of the business. For me, I felt like, wow, we're popular now. I'm getting sued by somebody I don't even know.
You're either rich enough to afford the law, or you're a complete outlaw.
If you can catch me, then I didn't do my job. They got so much technology today, they can just feed the up or whatever they want to do with it. And I don't even know it's me.
Look at how any bit of culture is made. It's about taking bits and pieces of your influences and forging them into something newer and stronger.
That's how society moves forward. It doesn't just invent new things. It evolves through taking old things and changing it. Goes through taking old things and changing it. Goes through taking old things.
Okay. So with a great piece of work like that, and you have to imagine how many edits would have gone into each of those sequences, the way that every record was referenced, and above all, the way that all the memories of everyone who was actually talking were being visually quoted. So when you think about digital media, we're kind of transferring that same impulse, but putting it in the digital, media. And I love the idea that graphic design is about providing people with these forms. And again, if you go back to our current mode of the app, you can easily see how there's been a long tradition of sort of evolution of graphic design into these tactile media. For me as an artist, is one of the fun parts about this is where it gets kind of murky. And I'm sure probably many of you saw the Obama Hope poster with Shep Ferry. He does the Andre the Giant has a posse sticker. He's an old friend of mine from college. It's a long story. But he used to go around and put the sticker up, probably in San Francisco, I'm sure. Has everyone seen that? Right? You want to talk about viral media, right? So the urban landscape, for me, is a place where you have this notion of private expression in public space. And these are kind of contested spaces. So if we apply the same network to the web, we can kind of see the network effect literally taken straight from this notion of the role of the street. The grid is the American sense of the logic of form, how we kind of organize space and time, and then above all, the fragmentation that goes into that idea of the mix. With my last book, one of the things that I was trying to figure out is it's 36 essays about sound and media, and I had a wide variety of people contribute. People like Brian Eno, Chuck D from Public Enemy, Saul Williams. I even got Daphne Keller, who's one of the senior legal counsels to Google. She wrote an essay about this idea of how Google's source code has highly influenced people's ideas around sampling as well, and so on and so on. So, as above, so below. One of the things I've always really been very partisan about is that the notion that the human imagination is divided into high culture or low culture, or for that matter, digital or non-digital, that's totally a fallacy. Every code head listens to music. Every musician somehow uses the idea of creativity to create all sorts of patterns and structures. And at the end of the day, like William Gibson would say, it's about pattern recognition. So if there's one thing that we're thinking about in general, probably everyone in this room, is how do we organize the vast amount of information that human beings have generated? And that's where the DJ motif of how the sampling and mix and navigating these structures has come home to roost. So your average kid is growing up being bombarded with more information than someone in previous eras would be given in their entire lifetime. There's neurological studies showing how people respond to information overload. Some people are calling it decision fatigue. Other people are calling it attention deficit disorder. I like to call it sort of the sampling, media kind of mentality. So what you're seeing here is not only the idea of multitasking, but the way multiple tracking, of how you think of a song or a sound is now the collage aesthetic come home to roost. It's a long story, but in the last couple of months, I have a new book that inherited some of the issues that I dealt with Sound Unbound. And one of the things I've been thinking about a lot is this idea of the acoustic font. What happens with memory and its relationship to kind of transferring and kind of editing and thinking about this idea of the 20th century's notion of mass production and the 21st century's idea of mass customization. So in the 20th century, the factory model, the idea that, of course, as Thomas Ford would say, or Henry Ford, sorry, he would say, you can have whatever color car you want as long as it's black. The Model T Ford mentality of how everyone would have the exact same thing, it's actually eerily like the iPhone at this point, kind of you have the black phone or the white phone. But that's slowly giving away. I wanted to try and figure that kind of idea of the mass customization of the idea of imagination in its own right. So I was trying to figure that out and say, all right, where's the only place on Earth where you can actually get away from all this? And I said, let's go to Antarctica. So I took a studio down to Antarctica, literally, and carried a backpack around and was doing kind of photography and design, and trying to figure out some issues around this idea of modern notions of how people, the idea in the 19th century they called the romantic imagination. You had Mary Shelley, Frankenstein, the first creature made from recombinant bits and pieces of other people. Frankenstein ends in the Arctic Circle and jumps on a piece of ice and floats away. But this whole notion of purity of the imagination, and you can see where that went with the Third Reich, the idea of the German, early notions of purity of nature. And if you kind of remix and pull that apart, you can start really thinking about how people in this planet in this time can, I think at least, say that nature itself, somebody earlier was talking about the extended phenotype, which is the whole Richard Dawkins notion of extended ideas of the nervous system and so on, which again, I'll just show you a fun, hold on 2 seconds. Yeah, there we go. It's Marshall McLuhan's record. And what that ends up becoming is, of course, how we as a culture now are literally beyond the notion of an information economy. So the reason I keep going back to this idea of the square and the record and the app and kind of using it as a metaphor, because you guys have probably had an entire day of people trying to figure out very specific niche ideas, so I wanted to go a little broad here, is to say, the mix aesthetic and the collage aesthetic is the way we navigate through information. Now, going to Antarctica is not necessarily the most mix-oriented place. I'll put it that way. It's pretty easy. Hold on one second. I wanted to show you some photos from the opposite end of the world. 1 second. Yeah. So I wanted to try and figure out, recreating historic materials and sampling visually how people thought of some of the most remote parts of the planet. And carrying a studio in a backpack and walking out on thin ice, again, you can kind of see really quick, this ice is melting and it's pretty extreme. But we chartered a 100-year-old ice scraper, and I would carry a backpack out into these ice fields and just try and actually get away from the sound of machines. You'd be stunned at how difficult that is. And if you kind of start thinking about graphic design and history, the archive and generating all of the new material that comes out of my work, this is what I have to do. This is real, what they call digging in the crates. So if we fast forward, some of the stuff I was trying to figure out was, okay, we have Antarctic ice currents. We're trying to figure out this notion of pattern recognition and structure. Now, as a graphic designer and artist, these are things I was thinking about. It's a continent where there's literally only 2,000 people in the entire place, but we're still being impacted on by these huge water currents, ice currents, and so on. And what does that do to the creative imagination? The risk of impacts of global climate change, factor that in. There's actually tremendous shifts in what they call sort of glacial movements. In fact, NASA just did a really interesting graphic design project about that, mapping ice flows. And above all, this idea of the map of the imagination for the 21st century. I know this is a conference about interface design and user interface especially, but I like to think of Antarctic imagination as this place where most people have a kind of a blank space in the imagination. And that's the point. It's a very rare moment where after a sort of hyper GPS-enabled imagination, where is off the map? Human beings rush to fill it in. Hold on 2 seconds. Now, imagine transferring between that to this. And the data aesthetic kind of kicks in, and you can kind of begin to think about not only simple methods of organizing complex information, but being able to transfer and pass it along very quickly and easily. And that's something that DJ Culture, again, I was thinking about the acoustic font, and now we move to the idea of the sound bite. Now, the sound bite, the acoustic font, the app. If you kind of keep going back and forth with that, you can start seeing how people get into information overload as a basic premise for modern life. And the Antarctic project was something that I felt would be a nice touchstone for this discussion about user interface, because guess what? We still need to explore these things. In fact, we're filling them in further and further as we go along. And as an artist, I'm very intrigued with this notion of ambiguity. What is off the map? Where is the space that hasn't been filled in yet? In fact, when I was hearing Trammell talk about Twitter, I met a really interesting historian a couple years ago who was a historian of forums. And if you think about it, some of the first major ways people filled in forums, people weren't quite clear of where to put the name or the address or the zip code. And a lot of that comes out of the Middle Ages and the transition of, I know this is going to be slightly a side note, but it's very intriguing. The way when you had the ghettos in Europe, Jewish culture, people had to come up with new names and be registered and be able to be tagged and marked in a way, not, just like, say, for example, if you had Katzenberger or Silverstein or, Greenspan and so on. These were all fictional names, and people needed to fill in forms, so they would come up with new names, much in the same way that American immigration happened, in the last century and so on. So the form was a way of organizing data about the self. And when I was seeing Trammell's idea of Twitter, by the way, which I've avoided for a long time, and I just got into Twitter a little while ago because we had a Twitter clone and some other stuff, and it's a drag. But it's a great medium to try and figure that kind of thing out. And you see how many people are filling in spaces documenting it, and being able to come up with new ways of expression in very small spaces. So you have this idea of rules and recursive logic, kind of repetition, update, and so on. So when I was in Antarctica, I kept thinking about, okay, recursive logic. There's a great book by Gödel Escher Bach by Douglas Hofstadter, where he's trying to figure out some of the core themes of modern life, how people deal with information overload, physics, and above all, this idea of the eternal return of the sort of Nietzschean ideas and so on. I'm kind of jumping around, but that's sampling. Sorry. All right, so if you start thinking about rules and structures, some of the most creative material comes out of when you have very specific rules that you're not allowed to bypass. 140 characters of Twitter, for example. But in nature, one of my favorite scientists and mathematicians is a gentleman by the name of Johannes Kepler, and he has a very famous essay, The 6 Sides of a Snowflake. So he was walking along several centuries ago, and a snowflake landed on his wrist, and he noticed it and realized there was an intense geometry going on. And what you can kind of start thinking about with geometry is it's about rules. So when you see a snowflake, or when you walk through a snowstorm, you're actually walking through pure mathematics. It's a hexagonal form that has different kinds of iterations. And the idea here is that you have mathematics at some of its best and I think most intuitive relationship to human beings. So if you keep going, you can kind of see how snowflakes and the geometry of ice actually is a very beautiful metaphor for information density. Nature has a way of organizing very specific rules, and those become recursive. And that leads to intense complexity. So if you look at complexity theory and people like Claude Shannon, who kind of came up with many of the issues that we think of with information theory, the idea of natural logic still informs so much of this. And you can see how beautiful and crystalline these forms are without necessarily understanding them, which most people, if you think about complexity theory, linguistics, and how people kind of try and figure out these forms and documents that we're looking at online, which is the user interface, you can think about nature's response to the user interface. And I just wanted to use that as a metaphor. So let's look at some of the ways that an ice piece would form, depending on temperature, depending on all sorts of things we go into, how it would actually be a molecular relationship very quickly. Ice is something we all know, but very few have actually explored some of the molecular structures of it. If you start seeing how nature would make a recursive logic of the hexagon and look at the complexity that will generate really quickly, you can kind of map one metaphor into the other and start thinking about this as a complex kind of relationship to the human imagination. So too with sampling. Now, the reason I kept bringing up the term pattern recognition is that graphic design is about organizing space. The user interface is about organizing an experience. And above all, how we map those two together is what makes something incredibly creative or not. Now, the metrics of how we kind of look at all of this is something I think you all are better prepared to answer than I am as an artist. But I can always say that we try and build bridges between the art form, these kinds of beautiful, complex things, and how somebody would be able to come up with a systems form of making it available to everyone. So hopefully, I know you guys are probably thinking DJ Spooky is going to get up here and scratch and all this crazy stuff. But the whole notion here is that we're looking at 21st century issues of complexity and trying to think of new ways to kind of engage them, and something that actually is interesting beyond the norms of just, there's so much that we already know and we've already experienced. What's the next step? So I'm hoping that this will be kind of a thought piece, and I know Jaron Lanier was here earlier. He's a friend of me. I had him write the end of my last book, and so me and him every once in a while have these debates about how people are being so compressed into specific formats. And what I think sound and this idea of mixing and sampling really drives people to start realizing is that it is about the sense of irreverence and being able to completely disregard the rules. So if you look at the origins of DJ culture, Thomas Edison was a kind of a quirky guy. He actually was virulently, bizarrely anti-Semitic, racist, and so on. But above all, he never felt that the turntable would actually be used for anything playful. It was meant to be a dictation machine so you could get rid of your secretary. And we can see where that went, right? So the accident, something where a device is meant to be one thing but is used for radically other purposes, this is where I think you can kind of look at the touchstone for hopefully what I'm leaving you guys with today. So when I was going through these old records in the Middle East just a couple days ago, and I was trying to imagine what it must have been like to be sitting in a cafe in Istanbul or in Beirut or in Cairo in 1901 or through about 1903, and some of the later materials that popped out of that. And then further on 1911, 1913, 1914, and how the graphic design of that time really influenced and then kind of re-evolved back to Europe and so on and so on. The Middle East was trying to figure this out very early, very interesting. And I'll leave it with this. The term algorithm, it's an Arabic term. It's simply as someone's name. But if you start going back to the way that people think of algorithms in general, the entire culture that we live on, based in, is algorithmic. So when I looked at these records, I started thinking how I would sample them, and like making patterns and rhythms out of this. And it's a project I literally just got off a plane, so I'm kind of using that as a personal metaphor for some of the issues I was talking about earlier. And algorithms, thinking about pattern structures, pattern recognition, and hopefully above all, using those as tools to generate new material. So I think that's about it for what I have to say today. And I hope I haven't bored you. Thanks.